All right.
All right, we'd like to thank all of you for coming to our presentation. We're going to be talking to you about MagneForce, a validation of a three-dimensional force sensor for gait analysis. I'm Brandon Lamb.
I'm David Borvit.
And I'm Nathan Stomberg. So just a quick disclaimer, the next slide will have a few graphic images of diabetic foot ulcers, so please look away if you so desire. So this brings us to the clinical background of why we're looking into this. So diabetes is extremely prevalent in the United States, affecting over 29 million people in the country, and in 2012 incurred a healthcare cost of over $245 billion. So there's this huge industry involved with the disease and a huge need to be met. Most specifically, there's a serious effect of diabetes, which is diabetic foot ulcers. This arises from diabetic neuropathy, which is nerve damage as a result from untreated diabetes. And as a result of this, patients will lose feeling in hands and feet, and the abnormal loading on the bottoms of the feet results in these ulcerations, which, when left unchecked, result in infections that ultimately lead to amputation or bone removal in up to 25% of patients. So this is a serious issue, and again, as I previously mentioned, the repeated abnormal loading and shear forces on the bottom of the foot really increases patient risk for these ulcerations. However, studies have shown that early regular screening and monitoring of these forces on the bottom of the foot can be beneficial for both preventing and properly managing these ulcers. Unfortunately, the devices that are best suited for this type of gait and force monitoring are large, they're expensive, and require a lot of expertise to operate. And so many patients may not be able to get to a gait clinic or something of that sort in order to monitor it as often as needed. On the other hand, the devices that go in a shoe that would be for more personal use are only marginally less expensive and do not measure shear forces either. And so this brings us the goal of developing an affordable and non-invasive device to reliably measure these normal and shear forces.
So to measure the normal and shear forces, we wanted to turn to something that we knew we could measure things in 3 dimensions. And so we turned to using magnets and reading their magnetic fields. You'll notice in figure 5 how there are 4 little squares on the green circuit board. Those are each magnetic Hall effect sensors. And what those allow us to do is measure the position of the magnetic field of the magnets that are suspended directly above them. You'll see in figure 6 is our finished circuit module. The whole thing is encased in silicone, magnet, and circuit board as well. And so we came up with this design and wanted to really focus on modularity because every shoe size is relatively different. So we wanted to make a system that you could put as many together as you needed. So in order to do that, we wanted to also limit the amount of inputs and outputs you would need per module that you would have to add. We went from having to do 4 for every circuit module that's added to only needing 2. And this is all due to the multiplexer that we were able to add onto our circuit. Unfortunately, the multiplexer was not enough to get our circuit up and running, so we had to add an XOR gate in order to properly be able to read properly read from each sensor. From there, we modularized it even more to try and get our system to be more standard. We went from having 9 wires coming out of our board to having an 8-pin connector. This allowed us to cancel out a lot of noise and just make our system a lot easier to use and work with. You'll notice in the that our system isn't just a circuit board; it's also a molded silicone module. In order to do that, we 3D printed a mold, as you can see in figure 7 and in figure 8. So we basically put the circuit board suspended a little bit inside the mold, had silicone go all the way around it, and then embedded magnets. You'll notice that the cap first in figure 7 and figure 8 are slightly different. It's because we needed a 2-step molding process in order to make wells for the magnets to be placed inside before we can completely encase the whole thing. We found that Dragon Skin 30 is the most effective silicone for our application.
So this brings us to the validation of our device. For this purpose, we used Console Multiphysics 5.2 as a physics modeling program in which we created a simplified CAD model of our device, and using this program, applied an evenly distributed 60 Newton normal force across the top face to simulate loading. And from the simulation, we were able to collect magnetic flux data that we used to compare qualitatively to our actual normal force results.
In order to prove that our device is actually working, we use the Instron 5544 uniaxial testing device to apply forces on it. So first we applied normal force on it, this evenly distributed 200 newtons, ramping from 0 newtons up to 200 newtons at a linearly increasing rate of 200 newtons per minute. The reason we use 200 newtons is because that's the maximum force that we were going to expect to see in the device, in the use of this device. To do shear, well, we have 21 newtons applied using Instron from the top, and also 200 newtons applied from the side using a weight that hangs off the table. This results in a 29.7 Newton force, a resultant force in 45-degree angle, and we held that for a constant 5 seconds. The reason for the 21 newtons force applied from top is to create a frictional force upon the sensor to basically give the shear data.
So here we have our normal force results. On the left side, you can see the results from our console simulation, and on the right side is representative data from a single sensor during our 200 Newton normal force testing. I'd like to direct your attention to the black lines on the tops of each of the graphs here. These represent the z-axis data, the magnetic flux data from the sensors. And the obvious trend is that as applied force increases in the normal plane, the z-axis data also increase. We ran a linear regression on both of these axes and calculated the r-squared values as well, both of which were very close to 1, indicating strong linear trends both between the simulation and the actual data. And so the big takeaway from this, again, is that the magnetic flux increases with the increasing normal force. Here we have our shear force results. Again, this is representative data from a single sensor in our tests. The left graph here is a test with a shear force applied in the negative y direction, and the right graph indicates a shear force test applied in the negative x direction. The boxes on each graph denote from left to right the force being applied to the sensor and then the shear force being released from the sensor. And so the blue line here on the negative y graph, as you can see, decreases. It moves, the y data becomes more negative and moves in the negative y direction when a force is applied in the negative y direction. And then the same for the x-axis, again, the green line indicating that the data shifts in the negative x direction when the force is applied in the negative x direction. And so here we can take away that the signal again shifts in the same direction with the same relative magnitude as the force applied. And so here we have a brief demonstration video of our product in action. So Brandon here is using a plate just to apply an arbitrary force to our sensor. Here the signal is fed through an Arduino through the serial port in the computer, which is then logged using PuTTY. As this data is logged, David then exports it to Excel, and using Excel is graphing the data from a particular sensor that is being picked up, both in X, Y, and Z. So from left to right, he's going to have the X-axis data, the Y-axis data, and also the Z-axis data. And from this you can see, just in a general sense, when Brandon pushes on the sensor, the data in Z increases from the normal forces. However, he wasn't steady when he was pushing down, so you can see a lot of shearing both in the X and Y directions as well.
By working with and testing these sensors throughout the year, we were able to prove 3 main proof of concepts. The first one is that we can relate the displacement of magnetic flux to the forces applied in X, Y, and Z directions. The second one is that there's no interference between each of the sensors. All the sensors can take their own individual data. And the third, the most important part, is modularity. We proved that we can hook up multiple modules to a microcontroller and run them at the same time. This is so that we can scale up or scale down depending on the size of the shoe or the application needed. We want to note also that it is small enough to be able to put into a modular device too, because of it's 36 by 46.6 by 17.4 millimeters.
So affordability and cost was a huge issue also. So we wanted to make a cost analysis of our system. So we found that we could fit 7 of these modules into a size 10 shoe, and from there we calculate the parts needed for 1 module, then 7 modules, and then multiply that cost by 3. So the cost would be for the circuit board, the components, and the silicone. We multiplied by 3 to account for both profit as well as the labor required to assemble these, and we came to roughly $500 for a total cost of our system. When compared to our competitors of TechScan's F-Scan system and the PIDAR system by Novell of $4,000 and $5,000 respectively, ours is significantly cheaper, and ours can measure shear forces while theirs cannot.
So we have, as the many devices that go, we have future work can be done. First, I want to point out 2 main things. One is that we can refine the circuit design to accommodate for more dynamic changes. Like if you were to hit something really hard, then it would be able to take in more data reliably. The second thing I want to point out is like if you can, the future work can be done in testing reliably over a large number of cycles. This is really good for household devices, because if you were to be able to use it multiple times reliably and be able to still have consistent data, then that would prove that it could be used in a household. The last thing is that we could also have it be professionally made, because we did it all in-house, and the circuits have some issues with signal data. So
we would like to thank everyone warmly for involved with this project, for their assistance, especially Lisa Wall, Elise Favreau, Kat Crichton, helping us in the labs, as well as Professor Onal and Professor Troy for their guidance, and our grad students, Anand and Nani. And thank you all for coming to our presentation. Are there any questions?
Can you tell us how actually being used, like within shoes or what, like?
Certainly. So there's a wide variety of applications here. As it currently stands, because of its thickness, a shoe would have to be modified to stick a number of these sensor modules in the sole. Our vision for this was that down the road you can use these types of sensors in a shoe pad that's much cheaper than the ones are available. And when it's available to a consumer, you can they can wear the sensors and monitor these forces, especially the shear forces on the bottom of their foot over the course of time. And rather than analyzing them themselves, would probably share that with a doctor or a physician, who would then tell them if they were at risk for developing ulcers, or if they have ulcers, recommend custom orthotics or steps to take in order to reduce those forces.
So then how do you, like, what about the power issue or wireless kind of connection?
So we focus more heavily on creating the technology that we could use to measure the normal and shear forces. Further down the line, we would add, given more time, we would create the shoe pad, as well as make sure all the wiring can be secure, and add like a battery or whatnot to power the whole system. But unfortunately, we focused more on getting the system to actually work, so we didn't have time to implement all those features of making the shoe pad actually work.
So ideally, in a situation such as that, you would want to incorporate either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, or wirelessly share that information with either an app on your computer, or just to save it in an interface that can be used by a clinician.
In addition to that, we're not actually moving any part. We don't have any motors and stuff like that, so the sensors themselves don't require as much battery, so the battery can last longer.
So I worked on a lunch project last year with Professor Onal. So I think it's wonderful. You got the shear thing working out really well. What I missed in the beginning was the specifications that you needed. Like for the application you talked about in the beginning, what do you need, and did you get it?
Certainly. So when we set out, we had the objectives of achieving high sensor density, as well as good update frequency and low variability. However, as time went on and we had we were faced with challenges both with waiting for parts to come in and trying to get the circuit to work on its own. A lot of these objectives fell by the wayside. So the big takeaway was showing that qualitatively the trends were evident as a proof of concept for normal and shear forces. David, what is the current update frequency of the device as it stands?
So for a single module, it should be able to update for each sensor be once every 4 milliseconds.
So the question is like, what do you need? So data's great. You know, do you need 2 milliseconds or do you need 0.1 milliseconds update? I have no idea. I'm just asking. And what do you need to do to? I know the spatial frequency, spatial density. I guess you couldn't get because of some limitations. But are the force levels what you need for a shoe, or are they?
The force levels are exactly what we needed because we tested with the 200 newtons, and that would be what we did was we multiplied how much the area of the shoe itself to the weight of around a normal sized person with a 10
yeah, so we took, for the normal force calculations, we took a 5'10" US male, looked up his weight if he were to be more on the overweight side, found that weight and turned that into newtons, and divided that by we calculated the area of the bottom of a size 10 shoe. And from that we took the ratio of our device to the area of the shoe to calculate roughly what the max normal force would be from that, which was roughly 200 newtons on a single module. We did a similar calculation for the shear forces. We were close. We were well within the range that we were looking for. From that, we determined that the max shear force that would be experienced would be roughly 40 or 50 newtons, and we, just due to the availability of weights, were only able to do about 21 newtons. So that was encouraging. I believe that for update frequency, the competitive devices are the competitors that we spoke of. The minimum update frequency in order to be able to track data as you move throughout the gait cycle was roughly 60 hertz. So while the update frequency of the sensors themselves that David just shared is fast enough, we have encountered issues with lag time. David tried developing a Java applet, and there was still a significant delay between when the data was collected and when it was displayed. So.
I think that's all time we have.